All right, this is Ronan Hart with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. We are speaking with Robert Christianson for the Florida Water Management Project. Me and Vasilios Kosmakos at 1020 at the Gainesville Co-Housing Project.
Yeah.
You want to introduce yourself as well?
Yes, hello, my name is Vasilios Kosmakos, and I'm here with Ronan Hart, and we're about to interview Robert Christianson.
If you'd like to state your name again for the record, and then just tell us, you can start with just where and when you were born, maybe your education.
Okay, sure. My name is Robert Christianson. I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1954.
Okay. What did your parents do?
My father was an optometrist, and my mother was a working mother of 5 children.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Youngest, oldest?
I'm 4th of 5.
4th.
Yeah, I was the baby for 8 years.
Another one comes along. Kind of a pattern that we've noticed talking to people end up in conservation is that they grow up with sort of a appreciation for nature, spend a lot of time in the woods, a lot of time in Boy Scouts or anything like that. Would that be accurate to your childhood?
Absolutely. Yeah, I was in Scouts all the way through. I did not get my Eagle certification. I think I got to Life and a bunch of merit badges, but fell short of Eagle. My father was a Scoutmaster. We, as a family, camped and traveled extensively. As a subset, my brothers and my father and I were very avid outdoors people. Camping, hiking, canoeing, cycling. Spent most of my time outdoors. And my father was also, I would say, he wouldn't have used these words, but he was an early conservationist and an advocate for protecting conservation lands and forward thinking with respect to things like bike trails and bike traffic and energy conservation. And so I think I took a lot of inspiration from him.
Mm-hmm. So could you say something about your education? Where'd you go to college? What'd you study?
Sure, yeah. I went to lots of schools, but I wound up getting degrees at the University of Florida. So that's how I wound up in Gainesville. I have an undergraduate degree in mathematics and a graduate degree, master's in environmental sciences engineering. At the time, it was affiliated with the engineering college. I'm not sure it still is, but my major professor at the university was Dr. Howard Odom, who's a fairly renowned leader in the field of ecology. And that was the end of my education, was with a master's degree.
What about the University of Florida, attracted you to come down here?
Well, I think first I was attracted to Florida. I went to Ohio State University in 1972, young and troubled youth. And,
Scouts didn't straighten you out.
Scouts didn't straighten me out. Those were fairly turbulent times. And like a lot of people, I really didn't feel aligned with school at the time. So I left school and came to Florida kind of on a whim. Florida had this image as a Midwesterner kid of, the beach and the sun and the sand. And I thought, wow, that sounds really neat. So I moved to Fort Lauderdale. And the truth is, I didn't really like the beach all that well, as it turns out. But so the University of Florida was, to my way of thinking, the premier institution in Florida. And so that's how I gravitated to Gainesville. I first came to Gainesville and actually took a bus ride up here in February of 1975 and just immediately fell in love with the city. It has some topography, it has oak trees, it has a lot of the things that were familiar to me that South Florida does not have. And I like the university, so I made arrangements and enrolled and eventually got my bachelor's degree here. I left, I went to school in Canada for a while and was fairly disenchanted with that experience. And then I came upon Dr. Odom's work, and he was really the magnet that brought me back to Florida.
Could you talk more about Dr. Odom?
Well, yeah, he was quite a guy at many levels, but he was. I haven't met very many people in my life that I would consider genius or near genius, but he would be among them. And he had a wonderful way of thinking about the world and understanding that everything's connected. And you can't separate man and nature. In fact, I think the title of his first popularized book was Man and Nature were in the title. I mean, he was really about that. And he advanced a lot of early theories in ecology that appealed to me greatly. At the time, I mean, my personal motivation was relating to energy and nuclear power, and I had this notion that, you know, it was important to think about energy in a way differently than we were, but I didn't really know what that meant. And H.T. Odom, is went by H.T., was an early thinker about energy analysis and how to understand how important it is to understand what we're investing in energy. And in fact, he advocated for the use of how much energy is embodied in our investments and things as a metric for making decisions instead of money, which was a very interesting concept. So I was really drawn to that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, usually in that kind of era among environmentalists, the movement would be against nuclear energy.
Yes.
Right? Was that was the?
That's where I started.
You're both in that wave. Okay,
yeah,
I see.
Yeah, and that was a movement.
Mm-hmm.
And as a whatever I was, 20-something, it appealed to me I gravitated to that because it seemed so. You know, H.T. used to use this phrase, it's like cutting butter with a chainsaw. It just seemed out of sync, out of proportion with what we as humans experience in this world and what we see occurring in nature. There's been some interesting transformation in the feelings and thoughts about nuclear power since then, but we won't get into that right now.
It might be outside the bounds of this conversation. So what kind of work did you start doing coming out of your education?
Yeah, so I finished my graduate degree in 1984, and it was hard to find a job. I think it's always hard to find that first job out of school. Times were pretty difficult then, especially in a field that was sort of as soft as environmental protection, which was really my passion. I did not want to go to work doing field studies. That was not my real focus. I was more interested in policy. And so it was a tough job market for me at a number of levels. I wound up going to work for the Department of Environmental Regulation, which is now called the Department of Environmental Protection, doing permitting for development relating to wetlands protection. You know, the 80s were just rich with rules and regulations and programs and funding for all sorts of varieties of environmental protection. In 1984, the Florida Wetlands Protection Act was passed, and there was a whole new wave of regulatory protection being developed, and I sort of jumped on that wave and went to work for DER doing permitting, which didn't pay much and was really outside my realm. I wasn't a field ecologist, so I learned a whole lot very quickly, and I really enjoyed the work. I enjoyed the legal framework, the whole process of interfacing between land development and trying to protect the environment appealed to me. But I was starting to raise a family, and it really wasn't making it from a financial standpoint. So I fairly quickly, I think after 8 months or so, I went to work for the Southwest Florida Water Management District. And I was hired to do two things. One was to help them develop a water conservation program to improve on the citizens of that region's use of water, which was a big emerging issue. We were having a lot of water supply issues, environmental impacts mainly. And then also to help them figure out what to do with the property they owned. So the water management districts at that point were still fairly young to varying degrees around the state.
I'm sorry, can you give us a time frame roughly?
1985.
Okay.
And at that time, the Southwest Florida Water Management District owned about 100,000 acres of land. And that land had been purchased mostly for big flood protection projects. And they were just beginning to think about, well, how should this land be used? They really didn't have a plan for managing it or interfacing with the public who had desire to use it for recreational purposes. And so that was my second task, was to begin to formalize how they would deal with lands which were in their inventory.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it sounds like you getting into this work were, I mean, part of the larger kind of social movement towards environmentalism and conservation. Was that generally the type of people you were working with in the district and the Department of Environmental Regulation? Were they also part of that wave, or were they more technical? What was the climate?
That's a really good question. It was a mixed bag. Water management at the time, going from the DER, which was culturally in the environmentalist realm, I would say, probably much more so than they eventually became. So yeah, I would, to the extent we can cast things, in that dichotomy, the DER was very much environmentalist. The water management districts, on the other hand, had a history of being engineering and infrastructure oriented. And the Southwest Florida Water Management District and the South Florida Water Management District were the two older districts. And they were born out of the need to build really big infrastructure projects and very heavy emphasis on engineering and not much emphasis on the environment. Again, I'm oversimplifying, but and the other point I would raise in my own reflection at the time was that the water management districts, the big two, had a reputation for being very much in the pocket of, if I put it that way, agriculture. There was a very close relationship between large agricultural interests and the water management districts because, water is so vital to agricultural production. And these big projects and the emerging regulatory program for water supply were vital to agricultural interests. And so there was a strong alignment politically between the water management districts and agriculture. So I had some concerns, to be honest with you, and I had to think through that. And that was a fairly primitive understanding that I had of what was really going on. Those were just the impressions I had from reading a few newspaper articles and talking to a few people. It wasn't like there was this branding of the water management districts or DER. It was just a feeling. But for me, I felt like the work that was being done by the water management districts and the emphasis of the two areas they were asking me to work on, I felt very comfortable joining them. But it was clearly at Southwest District at the time, there were two distinct they weren't balkanized, but there were two distinct cultures within the organization.
So, how did that dynamic play out then? Discuss kind of this intersection between these two cultures. I mean, did you feel like one side was kind of more pushed than another?
Well, I think as a culture, as a society, we were in a transition period. Largely born in the 70s, and in the throes of real implementation in the 80s. And so I think that the interactions at the Water Management District were quite reflective of the kinds of societal transitions we were going through at the time. They just happened to be in the area of water and environment. In life, so many things are about following the money. Well, the very unique thing about water management districts, as I'm sure you've learned, is that they have property tax authority, ad valorem property tax authority, and they have a non-elected board. And so you had this pretty impressive funding potential without control by an elected body, and with intentional separation from the authority of the state government. And that structure created a sort of almost defiant independence at the time among the board members of the water management districts. These appointed board members, they had a relationship with the governor, or they wouldn't have gotten appointed, but they didn't have to go run for office, which was the whole concept, is they could focus on their jobs. So they had a great independence. In the case of South Florida Water Management District, I recall my impression at the time was they were so independent and so defiant that there was a lot of pretty severe friction with the power structure in Tallahassee at the time. And so at the time, again, oversimplifying, in South Florida in particular, the rising environmental consciousness that really was playing out a lot in Tallahassee was fought in many respects and resisted in South Florida. Now, selectively over time, they became more environmentally activist in some respects, but they, I would say, leaned towards their more development, infrastructure, engineering orientation throughout. And so the environmental aspects, I think, were sort of quelled, most so in the South Florida Water Management District. At Southwest, there was a conversion, a transition that took place over, well, a decade, that I think they became somewhat more environmentalist. And again, we're overgeneralizing. In the north, particularly St. John's, I think there was a stronger environmental ethos which emerged within their leadership clearly. And just for my personal trajectory, so I left the Southwest Florida Water Management District in 1990 and went to the St. Johns River Water Management District. And I found, for me personally, I found a home at St. Johns River Water Management District that was, for me, much more aligned with my personal feelings in respect to what we're talking about here, which is sort of this dichotomous engineering, environmental tension.
So there was an issue raised, right, that, some people were saying that the districts were almost like authoritarian, right, and their ability to kind of raise taxes, right, that, they were kind of exercising too much power, right, according to some people in Tallahassee. Would you mind kind of elaborating on kind of that a little bit more? Because you did mention, that there was a bit of a, not necessarily corruption, right, but a little bit of a defiance on some of the...
Yeah, corruption would be way too strong a word for me. Some of it was just jealousy, At that time, the legislature was very engaged in environmental, in implementing this environmental scheme. The Growth Management Act was passed, and the various acts were passed relating to water management, and there was a lot of activity. And I think that the the big boys, South Florida and Southwest Florida, you know, they had their charge. They'd been doing it since either the 40s or the 60s. And it was somewhat of a nuisance to them to have to bring in all this new stuff. And a lot of it was requiring them to consider new things in their investments, to consider new things in how they went about their business, to consider water quality concerns, to consider wetlands concerns, to consider the need for more carefully regulating how water is used. The challenge to undertake restoration of environmental systems. I mean, these were all new things to those two water management districts. So I'm getting a little off your point, but there were times when South Florida and Southwest would say, you know, we don't need all this. We got a job to do here, stay out of it. And so that was, I think, the tension. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but that's how it played out. Yeah.
Doing these interviews, we've been really curious about the way that the political climate within state politics, you know, kind of trickles down into water management, especially the change in governorship and the way that can, you know, influence the board of directors or just the you know, the requests made on the water management districts, how they're meant to function. Was there a change in kind of the influence that the governorship had on the districts, you know, through your tenure? Did you see more influence coming down from Tallahassee, more like instructions to change the way things were done? What was that process?
Yeah, I would say dramatically so. Now, bear in mind that my first 10 years in the organization, I was just a mid-level guy, and I wasn't privy, perhaps, to some of the things that went on. But that notwithstanding, yeah, I feel that I witnessed a major shift in terms of Tallahassee. We'll use that broader term first. Tallahassee taking control over the decisions that were previously not made in Tallahassee, for the large part. I mean, for example, I remember a big controversy in the mid-'80s was, and I'll get my dates wrong from time to time, was Lawton Childs called, I think, all the Basin Board members and governing board members of the Southwest Florida Water Management District of Tallahassee for a meeting. That was a big deal. And the issue had to do with, uniquely in Southwest Florida Water Management District, their taxing authority was split up between the governing board and a whole bunch of basin boards, which was a kind of interesting structure, but it was very dispersed, and there was a lot of potential for conflict between the basin boards and the governing board. And there were some spats going on, and the governor brought them all in and basically said, hey, guys, you need to get along, or we'll remove you, or whatever the or else was. My point is, that was the level of participation. It wasn't on a particular permitting decision or a particular investment decision or a business decision that any water management district was making. It was higher up in the governance structure. And so that, I use that story to sort of highlight my perception at the time was the governor was involved in appointing board members and making sure that they, it was the right mix, and communicating with board members, probably on some occasion. He had a staff member at the time, Estes Whitfield, who spent a lot of time interacting with the executive directors and the board members at policy levels, at a lot of decisions, but it was a very, it was much more distant. It wasn't like in the moment, engaged in the business of the individual water management districts. Contrast that with what occurred kind of at about the time of the recession and I guess that was the Scott administration, and the rather draconian and direct involvement in telling the water management districts how to not only conduct their business and make decisions, but who should be on their staff. And that, again, that's just one example of that didn't happen overnight, that change. I recall in the late 80s and early 90s, an atmosphere in Tallahassee of engagement and collegial invitation. Those of us in the senior levels of staff of the water management districts spent a lot of time in Tallahassee working with legislative committees. We were invited to give testimony and recommendation and advice on all kinds of technical issues. I would think it's fair to say we were viewed as the technical experts on water issues. And as they developed legislative packages and addressed various issues, it was a team effort. And that began to distinctly change, and I won't tag it to a specific governor, but it, I'll broaden it out a little bit. As a political body, Florida changed dramatically from what was a blue Democrat world to a Republican world. During that transition, the relationship between government employees, just to put it broadly, and the decision makers in Tallahassee changed dramatically. And so I feel that we experienced that same shift.
So discuss kind of the real-world kind of applications of kind of that change you've been mentioning, right? Because the common motif that we've been seeing, right, is that we're kind of seeing that this transition of kind of more kind of collaboration, right, kind of starting in the 70s and 80s, right, to kind of a more, kind of like you said, like top-down kind of approach starting in the roughly the 2000s, right? Discuss the implications of kind of that change on projects, on, the way water's been managed and kind of the future of that.
Yeah, it's a little hard to tease out. And again, so much of what I experienced was not just a reflection of the change in the politics, but it was a reflection of more broadly in society, there were changes. I mean, I mentioned the recession. The recession had enormous impact on all of us, and in the water management districts, that was extreme. A 25% reduction in staff overnight, a similar level of reduction in funding potential, and that continued. And so I don't want to attribute that to just the political winds of Tallahassee changing. In some respects, the political winds were just a reflection of that challenge that we faced societally. Having said that, I think that the water management districts, to put it in the positive, before this sort of heavy control occurred, and my frame of reference here is mainly St. John's, but I did a lot of work with all 5 districts in my job, so I was pretty familiar with what was going on around the state. The water management districts of let's say the 90s, were quite progressive and quite activist and aggressive in the court of law, in the courts, aggressive in their investments, competent. For example, I mean, just may seem like a silly thing, but the employee, the salaries and benefits of the water management districts were substantially higher than state employees. Well, okay, what does that mean? That means you get more competent people. There was a level of competency, I think that's the word, and there was a level of support from those independent boards to go out and do your job, to implement your mission, which was becoming much more multi-pronged. You know, we used to talk about we had 4 areas we had to deal with, and they were sometimes competing. So from that picture of very effective, very well-funded, very well-supported advocacy, I feel like the districts have become much more subdued, seemingly much more political in their decision-making, much more controlled, much more fearful, and I think the result of that is very much to the, I'm sad to say, the detriment of the water resources of the state.
And
I mean, if it's on this topic,
more or less, yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So philosophically, right, the kind of discuss your, so the water management boards are appointed, right, as opposed to elected. Philosophically, kind of discuss what are your thoughts on that. I mean, do you think that's a reasonable thing to do given the water is a finite, given what water is, or do you think that it needs to be more elected? I mean, because it's kind of an interesting issue. I mean, should we hold people accountable, right, so they're not at the whim of corporations, right, or, you know, what are your thoughts on that? You see what I'm saying?
Sure. You know, taxation without representation is a pretty tough issue to advocate for. But I do. I think the wisdom of the original Water Resources Act and the revisions thereto that resulted in this funding structure are brilliant. You know, not only the decision to have a non-elected board assess a property tax, but also their geographic definition. The water management districts are defined by watershed boundaries. They're not defined by political boundaries. Those 2 factors are really why I went to work, or why I believe so strongly in the water management district system. And we used to talk a lot about that. And it was appreciated, it was acknowledged, it was held up as a model for the world, certainly a model for the country, of a very progressive scheme, in spite of the fact that it you know, it violated the catchphrase of taxation without representation. It was acknowledged as a really progressive and workable concept. There was accountability built into the system. And like so many things, that accountability has been upped and re-upped and upped and re-upped to the point that now there's so much control that I think that's the loss of the ability to have the resources and the support and the independence to be able to do good work. But I'm a big believer in the original concept. I think it's brilliant. And by the way, it does rely on, it does rely on, you know, the citizens of Florida did approve a constitutional amendment to allow for this to happen. And let's not lose sight of that.
We're curious what the relationship between the districts and the Department of Environmental Regulation, or now the DEP. What did that relationship used to be like? How has it changed? And what is that relationship like now?
Yeah, well, I can't speak much to what it's like now. I've been gone since 2015, so 6 years now. Yeah, the DEP in the 80s and 90s, they had a lot on their plate. And I would say, I think it's fair to say that in that era, the districts and the DEP were like cousins, or uncles and nephews or something. I mean, we were very aligned. There was a guy that I think was hired by, I'm not sure who paid for him, but there was a guy who eventually joined the water management system, John Wheely, and John's job, I remember back in '85, John's job was to go to every board meeting around the state and coordinate issues. And I think he was a DEP employee at the time. It's probably DER at the time. It was almost like, from the feeling of it was almost like the DER was the head office, and these were satellite offices in the 5 water management districts. It was a very close relationship, collegial, and largely the DEP really appreciated the fact that the water management districts were out there to do all this work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
And take the political flack.
well, and you know, the DER is by statute the general supervisor of the water management districts. So that, what does that mean? Well, that's what we all strive to figure out what that meant. But they were very involved, and on occasion the secretary of the department would come down and speak before the governing boards. That was always a big moment, and try and advocate and steer and push and supervise. But it was a very collegial relationship, and they had their rulemaking authority and their job to do, and we had our rulemaking authority and our jobs to do, and so it was good. I think it was very good. You know, like any uncle and nephew, we had our fights, but you know, we were all trying to get to the same place, I think.
I've never had a fight with my uncle.
Yeah, well, let's say siblings.
Sure.
I was trying to maintain the supervisory element of it. Yeah. You know, it degraded. And, you know, as of 2015, just personally, you had a secretary directing executive directors to take actions, personnel actions, and on and on, and just skipping the governing board altogether. To my view, a subversion of authority. You didn't have very many decisions being made by the water management districts that were not being directed and vetted. And I want to mention here, it's not just DEP, there's the governor's office. So over the years, the power in Tallahassee shifted there as well. So I'm sort of lumping together the control from Tallahassee. But a pretty adversarial relationship.
Can you kind of go into an explanation of why you think this kind of relationship degraded a little bit more?
Well, I think it was quite intentional.
And why is that?
It's control the decisions. The decisions and the money. Yeah.
To kind of rein in the districts that had been more independent.
Yeah, it's kind of hard. It's like watching a movie, you know. This we're talking a span of decades, so
Yeah.
it's a little hard to just say that's why. But yeah, I mean, in the broad trajectory, it was to control how we as a state were trying to manage water.
So, kind of explain a little bit, right? So, just explain the general trends you've noticed in water management over the course of your career that you've noticed.
Well, I think I just did. I'm not sure what you're asking me.
Well, like, we kind of went from a point. So, like, we kind of went from a point of, trying to, what was it, conserve water to, what did Noah mention?
There was the shift from flood control towards conservation in the 70s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
I gotcha. Yeah, so when I started in '85, like I mentioned, in '84 the Wetlands Protection Act passed, In 81, the Save Our Rivers Act passed. In 87, the Surface Water Improvement Management Act passed. There was all this expansion of scope. And the expansion was from a history of flood control and water supply to now engage in concerns for water quality, to engage in concerns for environmental systems, both wet and dry, and to try to restore the waters, lakes, rivers, streams of the state. And later, I mean, it's continued to refine from them. We've come into this whole focus on springs late, but generally it's in that realm of environmental protection, water quality protection, that we've now tried to expand to achieve. And that was really embraced. And I mentioned the 90s, and I'm just, lumping decades here, but in the 90s there was a level of excitement and engagement and challenge and new laws and new funding sources and figuring all this stuff out. Like, we've never done this before. Land buying, we haven't even talked about that. The water management districts became one of the largest landowners in the state of Florida. It was a really exciting time. Those challenges have just gotten bigger.
You just mentioned land acquisition. It'd be nice to start talking about more specific projects
Sure.
instead of the broad scale. Is there anything land acquisition or policy regulation-wise that you're particularly proud of? Anything you were involved in that sticks on your memory that way?
Yeah, I mean, when I reflect on my career, and if you talk to people about me, what you're going to hear about is land acquisition, because that really was my principal focus for 20 or 25 years. I bristle a little at just focusing on land acquisition because I enjoyed so much the land management. I mean, we built land management programs for hundreds of thousands of acres of property. That's a whole different realm. I was involved in the public works side of things, big restoration projects. And I can get into specifics on all those. But you asked me about land acquisition, so okay, let's go there for a while.
Okay. Yeah.
I feel like I'm, luckiest man in the world kind of thing. I hit a moment because there was a recognition in the 70s and 80s that protecting land, that is, putting it into public protection in some form, was a really important piece of conserving Florida's future. And there were all kinds of study commissions, and there were all kinds of legislative acts, and there were all kinds of programs started. And I started my career right when they began to get funded. And it's all about the money. So the snapshot for me is over the course of my career at St. John's, I was involved in basically $1 billion worth of land buying.
Wow.
And acquired 500,000 acres of land. I didn't do it individually, but I led the team that did that. Those are big numbers. We built the program for how to make that happen. Those were in the early times of when I was at Southwest. We started a program to identify what do we need to buy. Because, there was a recognition that it's important to protect environmental lands. Okay, well, we got 40 million acres out there. Well, which ones should we be targeting? And so that was also the time when technology was emerging, where we could use geographically based computer systems to actually try to identify lands which were important for acquisition. I'm quite proud of the models we built before we had the computer systems that are available today. The first iteration we finished in 1990 was a comprehensive look at the entire region of the Southwest Florida Water Management District, which scored basically every acre in that geography for where are the important areas to look to purchase to protect water resources. That was the Fortran and SAS and data collection. I mean, we built the geographic information system at Southwest on the heels of budget approvals to build that model. It was a couple $1 million or something like that. It took us a couple of years. That was a big deal. Scientifically, objectively, technically, policy, I think it was a really important step. So I would cite that. And the completion of that effort, I think, was largely why the folks at St. John's wanted to invite me to come over there. It's like, hey, this is happening. We want to do this too. Preservation 2000 Act passed, I believe, in 1990. I mentioned the Save Our Rivers Act passed in 81 and 85. It was authorized to be bonded. St. John's already had a lot of, they probably had a couple of 100,000 acres of land. And they also had an individual running their program, John Hankinson, who was one of the leaders. There's a handful of them. And John became a very dear friend of mine. And John actually was the one who hired me over at St. John's. And so I tutored under John. I mentioned Howard Odom earlier. I mean, John, for me, was a similar mentor to H.T. Odom. And I remember John, he was quite an exuberant character, and he played the harmonica, and he was about 6'6" and weighed 350 pounds. I mean, he was a presence, right? And jovial guy, and he wound up running the regional office for the EPA in the Clinton administration, which is how I stepped into his job, because he left to go to the EPA. But John used to say he had the best job in the world. It was to, he had to, I forget how he put it, he had to turn a phrase, but every northerner's dream, he had a fistful of money and he was buying, cheap Florida swampland. And his mantra was big, wet, and cheap. So that was the model in 1990. And we kind of refined that a little bit to focus our 500,000 acres or so of accomplishment over the next 25 years. So we set about doing a plan for guiding the program at St. John's River Water Management Districts. We were very actively involved in the statewide efforts to figure out what do we need to buy in this state. And, P2000, I think, was $3 billion over 10 years. And then subsequently you had the Florida Forever Act in 2000, which generated another billions of dollars. I don't remember the numbers. But the water management districts were a big, big player in that whole effort to buy lands for conservation purposes. And we could go into whatever detail you want. I'm very proud of that accomplishment. I'm similarly proud of our development of in 1990, when I got to St. John's, they had one half-time land manager. That was their land management program. Well, today, the land management program at the St. John's River Water Management District, I would hold up to any land management organization in the country. It's stellar. And it's principle-based, it's well-funded, it's well-trained, it's professional, it's quite something. And that's in large part due to the individual we brought on to head it up, Steve Miller, who was there for most of that time. But I'm quite proud of that land management program as well. Side note on that is one of the great points of wisdom of the statutory framework for the Save Our Rivers program, which generally was what the Water Management District's land acquisition program was referred to for quite some time, was that not only did it create a program for the water management districts to buy land for water protection, it, as I mentioned before, created the potential for the districts to bond their revenue source and leverage that to have more money to buy more land quickly. But it also had a commitment to provide a fund for managing the property. And it was a fund that rolled over, it accumulated. That was all done away with over the course of in this later political time frame and fiscal challenge time frame. The last thing I'll say is during Scott administration, there was a push, some of it by proclamation, some of it by legislation, some of it by, public declaration, to try to get rid of some of this land. There's too much land owned by these public agencies, and we need to get it back on the tax rolls, and we need to put it to work. And that was a movement. Fortunately, there had been a constitutional amendment adopted by the citizens of Florida some years before, which put a little bit of restriction on when you can get rid of conservation lands. And so the governor issued an edict that we try to get rid of some of this land. And our response to that edict, which took a couple of years and involved a lot more of the same very extensive computer GIS modeling and going back to the roots of what is necessary to keep for conservation purposes, and a lot of intergovernmental coordination with our county partners and so forth, and the citizenry, resulted in us keeping over 99% of the property that we had acquired. I'm particularly proud of that. It was done principled, it was based on the legal framework, and it was in spite of pretty extreme pressures to do something different.
So discuss the criteria that you kind of used to assess whether a piece of land was kind of worth buying, and specifically kind of mention if there's any particular areas that you are more proud of acquiring than others, or if there's one area that you kind of had to face more of an uphill battle on, but end up being more of a triumphant kind of victory.
Yeah, I'll try to do that. Sort of the no-brainer part of it is, we're the water management districts. And so one of our key objectives is flood protection. And one of the themes that St. John's figured out early on was the concept of non-structural flood protection. So South Florida, the Everglades, it's a series of canals and reservoirs, their system. Southwest Florida to a lesser degree. But the it's the southern part of the St. Johns River Water Management District is the upper St. Johns River Basin. That was originally part of that whole same system that was being designed for South Florida, a whole long series of levees and canals and pumps and moving water all over the place. Very engineering oriented, very energy intensive. That's a system, structural flood protection. St. John said, wait a minute, there's got to be a better way to think about this. And you'll notice now, for example, in Holland or different countries all around the world, there's efforts to reclaim the river, which is to use the floodplain for that purpose for which it is there, which is to hold water when it rains. The whole development of Florida was to undo floodplains, to encroach on them, to harness them, to get the water out of there so we can grow crops or we can grow houses. So this whole concept of non-structural flood protection was a reversal of policy of, now we're talking centuries, we're not talking even decades. So back to your question, how do we decide what to buy? The first premise is to accomplish non-structural flood protection, you need to focus on the floodplain. So there you go. We've got maps of the floodplain and we integrate that in there. I want to come back to one part of that as something you asked. What was a challenge, and what am I like keen on in that whole thing? I want to come back to that on the floodplain side. So, but floodplains were obvious. Wetlands, that's clearly in our charge. We were not sort of the environmental organization. So endangered species habitat, that wasn't really the focus, except those species which had a relationship to water. So we had to parse through that sort of carefully and include aspects of environmental protection. There were some very logistic realities. We wanted big parcels because they're more manageable and you can achieve your objectives more, and you can have a more efficient program. It's like having a cornerstone or a anchor tenant in a subdivision. You got to lock things down, right? So we did a lot of analysis of property records, and just by default, by intention, we worked with large tracts of land. There were some, and the last thing I'll mention is there was a significant partnership aspect to the land acquisition programs of this state throughout those decades, because the water management districts were just one player. You had DER and the state and other agencies in the state with acquisition programs. You had local governments with there's all kinds of energy and money to try and purchase lands for environmental protection. So the mapping of and coordination with our partners was a big element as well, because we co-funded an awful lot of these, which leveraged our part of the funds substantially. I mentioned $1 billion. That wasn't all directly earmarked to the water management districts. I don't remember the number, but a good portion of our success was leveraging with partners. Back to the floodplain, and then I'll finish on that. One aspect that I found very significant and was a bit of a challenge was, people say, well, you're in the flood protection business and you're in the wetlands protection business, so yeah, map all the floodplains, map all the wetlands, and really focus there. Well, wetlands have a whole lot of protection from regulatory programs, which is great, but they're also not very developable because they cost a whole lot to develop. Not to put aside mitigation, just the sheer engineering of putting development in. So they're very low value. I mean, back in 1990, a wetland was $350 an acre. That's great, but if you buy all the wetlands, what have you really accomplished for flood protection? Because here's my point. The floodplain extends beyond the wetlands. And it's those margins that are wet when it's really flooded, but not wet enough to be defined as a wetland. It's those margins that are the key, in my view, to non-structural flood protection. And so we embedded that in all of our models, and that was a conceptually difficult thing to get people to think about, because you're buying uplands. What are you doing? But that, to me, was a really key element to our success. We weren't just achieving acreage, because, we throw that, oh, you bought all these acres. You got to buy the right acres. And so in the non-structural flood protection element, that was an important piece. Last thing, I said that was the last thing on flood protection. Last thing on acquisition and acquisition planning. Back in the 80s, maybe going back even farther, there was a guy in Orange County. He was a county extension agent, I think, something like that. He worked for the federal government. And he was, I think his name was Swanson. He was a big proponent for protecting recharge areas. And he was ahead of his time. He saw what was happening in Central Florida, where the orange groves were being frozen out and they were being replaced by houses. So that we were growing houses instead, and all the loss of recharge to the aquifer attendant with all the asphalt and everything we have. And he's like, guys, you're missing the boat here. We really need to be focused on protecting recharge areas. And there's been legislation and there's been a lot of efforts to deal with that. That, I would say, is a shortcoming for us in the state of Florida, that we didn't focus more on protecting important recharge areas within our acquisition programs. We achieved a lot, but you have asked both for successes and failures. I think we dropped the ball a little bit on that for good reasons. The dollars were not there to, the political will and understanding of the importance of those areas was not nearly enough to generate the money it would take to buy, because those are the most developable areas. But that's a long-term shortcoming that I think has implications for our failures in springs protection. Let me ask you a question. Are you getting more than you want? Or am I, I have a tendency to get going too long sometimes.
No, we're getting phenomenal answers.
All right.
So keep on going.
Yeah,
so,
for the long
and I'm learning,
Yeah, I
learning an incredible
just
amount.
need a little feedback.
No, this is absolutely fantastic.
Okay.
Really, yeah.
Thank you so much.
You just mentioned that it was difficult to get people to wrap their mind around why you would need to buy uplands for these floodplain programs. I feel like that connects to something larger that I find really fascinating about the district and all the districts in this work is that it's a governmental regulatory body where a lot of the time we come across as the best solution is to just let nature take its course with places like non-structural flood protection is what you're talking about. That's it's amazing. That's kind of a like environmentalist kind of hippie like way of seeing things. I'm sure from the perspective of like, the governor, politicians who might not have that philosophy or see things that way. And yet you all were able to successfully, implement that kind of approach. What was it like to, as you said, get people to wrap their minds around it, to convince people that this was a valid approach and not just some kind of like hippie,
Yeah. Well, the non-structural flood protection aspect somewhat predates me, the getting to there. But it really boils down to a few people who got it, who were in a position of some authority and had a method of communication with the decision makers that they carried the day. I mean, it comes down to a few people getting it and being smart enough and patient enough and good enough communicators and having a willing audience, back to the independent boards, to embrace that. I haven't said today that one of the keystones to St. John's success was to listen to the science first. And there were a few scientists, not a lot of scientists, but there were a few scientists at St. John's who really dug into these questions of technically, how should we be addressing this problem? And the organization was somehow able to embrace and make their decisions based on the best science, which today is kind of unthinkable. But, I remember Henry Dean, the executive director at St. John's for many years, that was his mantra. We take the science first. You think about Lake Apopka, and I don't know what you've heard about Lake Apopka, but that was a huge effort for the St. John's River Water Management District to try and cure the ills of that, which was originally the second largest lake in the state of Florida, that was, turned into a cesspool. And Henry, and you mentioned Catherine and others, and the scientists looked carefully at it, invested millions of dollars in data collection and research and modeling to understand scientifically, what should we be doing? Taking the time to study it in an investigative mode before you jump in with some fast solution. That process played out on project after project after project at St. John's. And the other districts. I don't mean to single out St. John's, it's just I was there.
So kind of like Ronan was saying, right? There does seem to kind of be a switch, right, between the kind of this approach of, we need to make straight lines, right? We need to do canals, we have to do other stuff, to like a more holistic kind of ecological approach, right? Nature knows best. We need to go within nature systems, right? So philosophically, you have a transition in the science, right? That kind of happened. I mean, kind of, in your experience, right? Kind of explain why do you think that happened, right? Do you think that's just a result of just kind of the climate of the time, kind of just generally speaking, or what
I don't know. I mean, my degree is in systems ecology, so it kind of came naturally to me.
Yeah.
But, we could talk about this country's response to the environmental challenges of the industrial period from, late 19th century into the middle part of the 20th century. We just went nuts, as a country. And, 90% of the longleaf pine were removed from the southeastern United States. I mean, the Rachel Carson's
science
books, and we're the Endangered Species Act, and we were, rivers on fire, the Cuyahoga, the list. And we as a people responded to that. And Earth Day, and all the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, all this stuff didn't happen in a vacuum. It's because there was support and a demand from the populace to do something. We're poisoning ourselves. And we've made huge progress. We continue to make progress. We've fallen back on a lot of realms. We didn't used to talk at all about climate change. Well, it wasn't in front of us back then. When I first started in my academic career, we talked about King Hubbard's blip, which was a simple graph of energy use. And going back to the initiation of the Industrial Revolution, energy use went up, dramatically. And it'd reach a point, and then boom, it falls off. So over the long course of time, that's just a blip. That's why we called it King Hubbard's blip. And I believed at the time that we were approaching the drop-off. That's the kind of stuff we were talking about. Now we're talking about it, and we're using words like climate change. It's the same thing. So you asked me a question of, I think, why were we able to think holistically? Why were we able to get the support of the decision makers to take a systems approach and to use environmental solutions like non-structural flood protection or building marshlands to treat water quality problems instead of trying to, engineer a solution out. I really think it was a reflection of who we are as a people. The people who were appointed to the governing boards through those years had enough I'm going to use the word right, enough of the right people to be receptive to the scientist. And as I mentioned before, we had very competent scientists. And it all just sort of organically happened. And it was a splendor to behold, really. I mean, sounds kind of an overstatement, but I feel like I was really lucky to be in the midst of that. And it's gotten more challenging.
Yeah, and I mentioned this question because I do kind of see, at least in my opinion, that science kind of went from a very kind of structuralist kind of way of viewing the world, right? It's very materialist to it's becoming a lot more holistic, right? We're starting to understand how everything kind of connects to each other, like the first thing you said in this interview. So I think kind of that ability for us to kind of understand how all these pieces are fitting into the puzzle is kind of allowing us to kind of deal with these issues a lot better.
We're getting there. You know, I always said we're in a race to the finish line, and I'm not sure who's going to win. I, on a personal level, I work really hard not to be cynical, but it's hard. But I remain optimistic that we are finding solutions, not just in environmental issues, but social issues and how we treat each other and so and so and so. I mean, I have to maintain some degree of optimism to get up every morning. And we do need to pause and take note of how much progress we've made. In my short lifetime, I mean, we've made enormous progress. We've messed a lot of stuff up, but we've made enormous progress. So I remain optimistic.
It's almost hard for, I think, I mean, for me at least, to conceptualize that period where you had the environmentalist social movement and then the government responding to that and being, you know, having an open ear and actually implementing all these policies, really like almost revolutionary policies for the time, the Endangered Species Act and things like that. And seeing that against today when the government is, you know, a lot less responsive to social movements or that kind of pressure. I don't know. That learning that makes me less cynical that at least it's possible at some points in American history for those changes to happen and the government to actually put in these, you know, a lot of people have referred to things like the SWIM Act or even just the establishment of the districts as revolutionary or incredibly like far-sighted. So, you know, it's been done before. It can be done again, I think.
Well, yeah. I mean, I have a four-letter word for you, vote. But the statute is still there. The Water Resources Act, the bones of it, are intact. I have hope and optimism that we can, you know, that pendulum will swing back. It's not like we burned everything. We're in a moment. That's my personal philosophy. And so I'm not going to get down about it. I have kids and grandkids. I mean, I'm really looking forward to them enjoying their world.
And they get to enjoy all the land you acquired. You know, places like Big Talbot, up by Jacksonville.
Yeah, well, I didn't buy that one, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So kind of going off what you just said, right?
Wait, I'm sorry. Big Talbot was Henry Dean.
Yeah, he mentioned that to us, and that was, you know, I love that place.
Yeah.
And that kind of made it click in my mind that, oh, people had to do a lot of work to get places like this to not just be condos and like cattle ranches.
Yeah, I used to talk about counting missing condos. You know, there was a period of time when everybody wanted to have metrics. We had to measure everything, right? I'm going to count missing condos.
So you just mentioned your kids, your grandkids, right? What's kind of like the message you kind of have for them and the people listening about kind of what the plan is going forward?
Don't be cynical. It can happen. We are basically good creatures, we humans, you know. I mentioned vote. You know, vote your conscience. Be educated. You know, I, in spite of everything, I still believe in the notion of an informed electorate being a good idea. I believe in democracy. I believe in this country. I believe in our principles. I think we've really lost our way, but I believe in, it's just like I said, the statute is still there, you know? So we have to take, you know, I don't like the we and them. So that's another principle. It isn't about them versus us. It's we. It's all of us. We have to get our grounding again, get some traction, and understand what are we trying to achieve, and have an objective, informed discussion about, well, how can we get there, and make decisions based on a common sense of what we want to be. That's the disconnect to me, is that if you talk to 100 people in the street, the majority of them want pretty much the same thing you want. But there seems to me to be a disconnect between that common objective and how decisions are being made. So my hope is that we will try to fix that and get back to not trying to always be right, just trying to understand, okay, what do we want, and let's join together to get there. That sounds pretty soft, but that's where I'm at.
I kind of really like what you said about how, we're kind of, we found ourselves, right? But now we're kind of almost in like a lost period, right? And it's like, sometimes you kind of have to get lost, right, to find yourself again, So it's like, maybe we are kind of going through a little bit of a difficulty right now, but maybe that's going to provide us the kind of fuel and the energy to kind of really kind of go things, to really kind of blast off, in a couple of years or kind of going forward. So, I try to remain hopeful. It's like, I think at the end of the day, that's all you have is hope.
Well, we have the luxury in this country of being able to stop and think about this stuff. And unfortunately, we have the luxury to create all these systems that have made us lost. Most of the people in the world don't have that luxury. And so I feel a great obligation to not abuse that luxury, but to turn it into something progressive and positive for that larger outcome. It's, we're a bunch of spoiled brats.
Yeah.
And, I also like to talk about we're a young country. And just like we're a bunch of weeds. We've grown incredibly fast. And we're just now, I think, starting to mature. We're starting to face up to some of those things. And we were really, really good at being weeds. If I'm using the analogy with the natural world, weeds grow really fast, and they soak it up, but they're not very sophisticated, right? So we're in transition.
Yeah. This conversation has been remarkable in its scope and its kind of overarching themes, which we don't get to so much in these conversations. But
systems ecology.
Systems ecology. So you could chalk it up to. But I would like to give you a chance to talk about any, specific stories, anecdotes, just the little moments that come up when you get, a bunch of very smart technical people all in like the woods together.
Stories or anecdotes. Most of my stories or anecdotes are about people. Mm-hmm. And land deals. When you've got a checkbook that's, has 7 or 8 digits, and you're out there talking to people who own, a lot of farmers, farming families, a lot of corporate owners, you run into a lot of interesting characters. And so, but I don't know that I want to jump into that. One thing I wanted to talk about, I guess, was the head of the fellow who was, I want to acknowledge Ed Lowe. Ed Lowe is a brilliant scientist, environmental scientist. And I mentioned to you at the beginning, I've only met a few people who might approach genius. Ed's on that short list as well. And Ed was kind of to my mind, is kind of unsung hero of the integrity of the science of the St. Johns River Water Management District. And issue after issue after issue, he had an in-depth understanding of how the water systems of Florida work, and was able to present with great, objectivity, and his vocabulary was phenomenal, and he'd just blow everybody away. He was the nerd in the room, but he'd stuck to his science, and he built a team of scientists who were, you know, quite renowned in their own, and the attention to science and data, and let the data be your guide, and the theory were quite remarkable. I'll I guess tell the story of Lake Apopka a little bit. I mentioned Lake Apopka earlier. Used to be the second largest lake in Florida, right after the Second World War. The northern 20,000 acres of the marsh connected to the lake were levied off and pumped out and for purposes of agriculture. And it was it was the breadbasket to the Northeast for vegetables, a breadbasket. There was a cooperative of maybe 25 owners of farmers, and that, along with other things like sewage being dumped in the lake, killed the lake basically. To the point that in the 80s, the lake, whereas there used to be probably 50 fishing camps all around this beautiful lake, there were maybe 2 or 3 left, and you know, it was not a place you wanted to be. You had 2-headed alligators and sterile creek. I mean, it was just a nightmare.
Is that a real thing?
This is a real thing. I'm not telling you.
The 2-headed alligators?
Yeah. There was all kinds of, you know, endocrine disruption in the reptiles. I mean, this goes on and on. It was a lake that when you looked at a satellite image, we didn't used to have Google, right? You look at a satellite image of Florida in 1980, and particularly if it had any false color infrared or anything, but just the satellite image, those first satellite images were just mind-boggling for humanity. But Lake Apopka jumped off of the map because it was bright green because of the algae. And it was, you know, singularly notable as a nasty lake. Okay, so that's the backdrop. The St. Johns River Water Management District was all about trying to clean up that lake, in part in response to the Swim Act of 1987. They already had some history there from a regulatory standpoint. And the legal framework is fascinating. I won't get into that. But there were pretty severe fights between the agriculturalists and the Water Management District for quite some time to try to get them to get a handle on their discharges, because they're just pumping, belching huge amounts of phosphorus-laden water to drain their fields and directly into the lake. And the lake was suffering dramatically. I started thinking about this because of Ed. I mentioned Ed Lowe. I mean, he somehow looked at this enormous system and over the years figured it out. But in the mid-90s, you know, I think it got to the point where the farmers said, "Uncle, I give. I'm tired of fighting. Buy us out." And so there were legislative acts passed in 96. There were appropriations made. I spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. trying to drum up more money. We started a big project to try to implement the will of the legislature, which they did say buy them out, but if you can't, then we're going to do this. To go do an engineering solution, and they're going to have to pay. So, I mean, it was a complex statute. Between 96 and 99, we successfully purchased 15,000 acres of farmland, and it was very bittersweet. We basically collapsed an entire industry. And, you know, the farmers did fine. They got $120 million or whatever they got. The people that I was, you know, the local economy was shattered. The largely immigrant population of farm workers were cast aside. And so it was very bittersweet. But it was the thing that we believe would solve the problem of the lake. In around Thanksgiving of, I think it was 90, it doesn't matter what year, but I think it was 98. We were in a process of converting these agricultural lands into a restoration area. And we, working with the farmers and the drainage district that was leaving the area, we worked to have the floods shallow flooded for a period of months for weed control and as part of the initial conversion into to transition into a natural ecosystem. And tragically, in the November, December period of 1998, there were thousands of birds that died. And this was one of those events. They've happened all around the country. Once every 5 or 10 years, you read about this major bird die-off, and this was one of those. I'm not trying to minimize it at all. There's all kinds of stories to be told about trying to respond to that. Everything from the Department of Justice and their guns to the Endangered Species Act and
real guns or metaphorical guns?
Yeah, real guns, and to the explosion of mice that occurred when we drained the field, and we had just all floods, famine, mice. I mean, it was just everything. It was biblical, right? Yeah. But here's the story. The Water Management District responded to this disaster by appropriating somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 to $4 million to implement a multi-year, multi-pronged scientific investigation to figure out what happened, what killed these birds, because nobody could figure it out. We followed all the environmental rules to clean up the property before we bought it. We did all these stuff. I mean, everything was done right. And yet, we had this disaster happen. So back to Ed Lowe. Ed assembled a team and furthered the science to the benefit of the world on the whole topic of agricultural fields in organic soils and pesticides and their accumulation and uptake into biological systems, which is a very, very complex realm. The science was advanced dramatically in response to this, and we furthermore appropriated another $10 to $15 million to mitigate the situation and basically flipped all the soil over 10,000 acres and all this crazy stuff. And today, it's a place where people go to go bird watching. Lake Apopka is coming back. I mean, this is a true success story. And it took the trajectory on that, it took 35 years to get from those closing fish camps to where we are today. And so I guess the story is about what a gut-wrenching experience it was to be in the middle of all that. How many successes occurred along the way, how many tragic things happened along the way. But we maintained course and followed the science. And you asked earlier about what am I proud of. I mean, that one doesn't come up very often because it was so bittersweet. But to be part of the team that, I think about it generationally, I am really proud of what we did for Lake Apopka, for the citizens of Florida. There was a lot of collateral damage, but we maintained the course. So,
when discussing kind of development projects, right, specifically stuff like, Lake Apopka, you do have this collateral damage that can occur, right? So, for example, stuff with the migrant workers, the collapse of industry. I mean, how do we interpret that? Is that just kind of like a loss to kind of get a better gain, or, I mean, because what do you do with those types of people, or what do you do with those people that do kind of lose out,
Yeah, it's really challenging. There's no simple answer. I've built a few homes, and I've built a few homes I've bought property that was raw land, and I've had to take down trees to build a house and clear a little area away. This project we're sitting in right now, this was a park when we bought it. And we had to come in and knock all the trees down. And people freaked out, you know? And I understand that. Change, no matter what the change is, there's collateral damage. There's downsides. We have to do everything we can to anticipate it, to mitigate it, and to respond to it. But we can't completely avoid it. And that's the trade-off that's such a challenge in anything we do. So, I mean, there were programs implemented through the governor's office and the legislature to try to help the local economy, to try to help the farm workers. I thought they were pretty, you know, they could have been better.
Weak. Yeah.
There were a lot of measures implemented so that this will never happen again. And a big part of that was advancing the science.
I think we could probably wrap up in the next few minutes. This has really been incredible.
Yeah.
My favorite one of these so far, I'd say.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
I have no more questions unless you do.
I mean, this is your chance to put anything you want into the historical record, into the archive for, you know, however many generations from now to look back at.
Yeah.
It's a lot of pressure, but if you have anything to that effect that you'd like to add before we wrap up.
Well, it's a bit of repetition, but I think you've got to get the governance right and you've got to get the people right. And I was really lucky to fall into a system where the governance, in my opinion, was phenomenally progressive. And there was money, and you had the right people making the decisions, and they had the independence and freedom to do so. And I was also just remarkably fortunate to be amongst a group of peers who had a common vision, had a clear sense of mission, and were given the resources they need to thrive. And so that's my reflection, is that, you know, we can do this. I remember in 1998, we did a reorganization. I took over this whole wing of the organization called the operations. So it's all blue-collar workers, heavy equipment operators, mechanics, all that stuff. And I was meeting with a group of them. They were all kind of lined up, and I was introducing myself and saying how much I was looking forward to working with them and everything. And this one fellow was from the islands. He stepped forward and said, "Hey, excuse me. He was very bold, right? Because these guys, they didn't talk, right? "Excuse me, Mr. Christianson, what exactly would you say is your job?" And I was like taken aback a little bit. And I said, "Well, that's a really good question. My job is to work with the governing board to make sure I understand what they want, to let you know what your job is, to give you the tools to get that job done, and to get out of the way." He said, "That's a very good answer." Anyway, that's it.
That's it.
We can conclude there.
What's a wrap?
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That was really incredible.